Hello recap lovers, welcome to the Mystic Recaps. In today's video, we'll watch a 1993 action film, Falling Down. So, grab your popcorns and keep an eye out for spoilers. On a sweltering summer day, a weary Foster finds himself stuck in endless traffic, knowing even his car's air conditioning won't provide respite from the heat and noise of other cars around him. He is driven to breaking point when an unwelcome fly joins him inside, prompting this exasperated soul to give up on his journey home entirely. A fellow traffic victim alerted a police officer. However, his plea for justice was met with resistance by a detective. Prendergast was also present at the scene and intervened in order to offer assistance. The three of them decide to take action and pushed Foster's car off the road. Foster then made a frantic phone call from a payphone nearby. He didn't utter a single word as he glanced at his quarters in the scorching heat. Unsettled and feeling desperate, he began walking towards a convenience store a few blocks away in search of change. Foster is trying to beat the summer heat and he stops into a corner store in search of some change. He takes it upon himself to purchase something from the shop, picking up a Diet Coke, but rubs it on his face in an effort to quell the heat. However, the owner refuses to give him any, leaving Foster frustrated. When the shopkeeper tries to shove Foster out of the store, angry words are exchanged before tempers burst and a brawl ensues. In the chaos that follows, Foster manages to get hold of a baseball bat and vandalizes much of the store's contents. Foster is being wrongly accused of stealing, so he decides to use this as an opportunity to defend his consumer rights and challenge the exorbitant prices. He picks up numerous items from the store shelves, bombarding the staff with questions about their prices, only to be met with ever-inflating prices. This sparks an uncontrollable sense of rage within Foster and causes him to snap, resulting in a fit of vandalism across almost every corner of the store. He picks up the Diet Coke once more and inquires about the cost, and this time, thanks to what had happened earlier, he manages to get a discounted price. He pays for the item and leaves, feeling satisfied. On his last day in office, Prendergast went through an old-fashioned hazing ritual in which one of his coworkers left a cat turd on his desk. Sandra then came over to confirm the lunch meeting with him before departing from the room. Prendergast then reached out for a photo of his daughter that was placed on his desk and held it close to himself, as if he was trying to take solace in her presence even when she wasn't there with him. Foster desperately tried to reach his wife by phone, however he was met with only silence on the other end. Without any response, he took to walking the streets of the city in the night, a bat slung over his shoulder for protection. Prendergast's wife called him home earlier than usual. In an effort to comfort her, Prendergast insisted that he would be there soon and offered to sing her a song as sweet solace. She joined him along and they sung until both said their goodbyes. In the next scene, Foster is sitting alone in an isolated spot, his gaze affixed on the distant horizon when, suddenly, two intimidating men approached him. They warned Foster that he was trespassing on private property and their words were met with a cheeky response from the man. Although his words were almost provocative enough to escalate the situation, Foster managed to stay composed and keep them from becoming hostile. The thugs demanded payment for this minor indiscretion and proceeded to ask for his briefcase. Foster refused to comply with their demands and took matters into his own hands. Though terrified, he mustered up enough courage to swing the bat at the two men, scaring them off and leaving him with the knife. Meanwhile, Prendergast was making arrangements for his exit from the facility as he heard about what had occurred. When Lee finally arrived at his desk, Prendergast quizzed him on every detail of the vandalism incident that had transpired earlier. Brian and Prendergast looked at each other in disbelief when Lee described how events unfolded when Brian took him away, as there had been no signs of a robbery. Foster tried to call Beth again, his wife, letting her know that he would be coming home for Adele's birthday, but she wasn't having it. Beth was adamantly against the idea and they got into a heated argument. She made jabs at him, saying that they were better off without him. The two hoodlums, who had been rolling through the neighborhood earlier, caught sight of Foster. They whipped out their weapons and started to fire at him. Despite the sudden attack, Foster remained still and walked off with a slight limp. Unfortunately, some of the bystanders on the street were struck by the bullets. The criminals ended up in an accident instead. Heading towards the wreckage of the car, Foster discovered them heavily injured, taunting them mockingly as he passed by. He then proceeded to grab one of their guns and shoot one of them in the leg as well as confiscate all of their ammunition before escaping from the scene. Prendergast reached out to his captain after what had happened, discussing about the shooting incident that was just witnessed. His captain asked about Prendergast's retirement plans only for him to reject it abruptly and explain that he'd lost his little girl recently. Foster attempts to get to the coach, but the sheer number of people surrounding him proves too much and he decides to take a different route. Unfortunately, his journey is disrupted by a road construction worker in the middle of the street. Back at her house, Beth converses with law enforcement officers about Foster and informs them that there had been an order issued against him for violence. While she informs them that he had not hurt her or the child, but she is still concerned. Whilst walking away from his troubles, Foster is stopped by a random stranger who begins to tell him a story with hopes of getting some money. The man persists, however, and eventually Foster is moved into giving him his briefcase. When opened, it only reveals an apple and a sandwich. At the station, Angus, who was present inside the car belonging to one of the thugs earlier, is questioned by police officers about what happened during their encounter, while Pendergast watches from outside. She informs the police that an assailant was a white guy with a baseball bat. When she mentioned the baseball bat, Prendergast walked in to ask for more info on the guy, but was stopped by Sanchez, a fellow officer. Next, Foster arrives at a restaurant and requests some breakfast. However, he is told it is no longer available. Annoyed by this news, he demands to speak to the manager only to be given the same answer again. The two parties began to quarrel over whether or not breakfast was actually being served when Foster unexpectedly pulled out a gun and fired it into the roof above him. Everyone around him suddenly found themselves filled with fear. Despite his threatening behavior, Foster eventually received his meal but instead chose to have lunch instead of breakfast. He insists Rick fulfills the order, and in doing so he tries to spark some conversation with the people around him. However, when Foster tastes the meal prepared, he can't help but voice his displeasure due to what he feels is a false marketing of their products. Over lunch, Prendergast and Sandra begin discussing her plans to move away to Lake Haven, implying that it was all due to pressure and demands from her husband. When her significant other walks in, the details of the earlier incident resurface. Meanwhile, Foster, whilst browsing through items at a store, gets intrigued by a ball with a pony attached. The situation outside isn't as pleasant, however. Just across the street, a man has been arrested for protesting against unfair economic policies enforced by the government, leaving Foster almost stunned by what he has witnessed. Sandra and Prendergast were discussing the shooting event which had left many people terrified. Sandra told him about a suspicious gym bag with guns. Prendergast, concerned for her safety, urged her to be very careful when looking into the matter. Foster enters a weapons store, wearing an outfit which immediately caught the eye of the owner. The man began to talk to Foster about his shoes but then proceeded to tease two homosexuals who were within earshot. This resulted in an altercation where the man brought out his gun and pointed it at them. Just outside the window, Sandra was seen exiting a police car with Prendergast by her side. Prendergast asks Angie for more information on the gym bag containing guns, but no answer was provided. As soon as she walked into the shop, Sandra asked if anyone had seen a man matching Foster's description. The owner attempted to flirt with Sandra, but is met with powerful rebuke. When Foster asked Nick why he had done this, he replied that he was only trying to be a friend and then showed him his collection of abstract condiments from wars in the attic. While touring around, Foster stumbled upon Nazi literature and flags. Nick then revealed his ideals of Caucasian racial supremacy. He attempted to make common ground with Foster but was rejected immediately. In a rage, Nick pulled out his gun on Foster and kept him hostage. As Nick rummaged through the gym bag, Foster threw the glass ball towards him. Foster brandished his knife and swiftly jabbed it into Nick's neck, quickly followed by the sound of a gunshot that echoed through the room. Prendergast desperately tries to explain what had happened to the captain, but was met with mockery and disdain. Sandra enters and asked Prendergast about the incident at the burger place. In response, he coldly told her that he didn't care anymore, and he refused to engage in any further discussion about her opinion concerning his wife's overreach. Prendergast recounted how one night his wife had mistook him for a ghost, believing he was dead when he arrived home later than expected, as she ran away from him in fright. Suddenly, Beth received another call from Foster, who informed her that he had reached the point of no return and would soon be coming home. He mentions of South America and the legality of killing a wife for insulting behavior as a means of threatening her. Sandra and Prendergast made their way to Lee's store to discuss further, but they were both taken aback when they noticed the billboard that was draped in mourning, as well as all the traffic that had gathered around it. This drew his attention immediately, so he decided to investigate further and asked Sandra to run the plate of a car that was located nearby at an earlier time. Walking down the street, Foster encountered a construction worker who he argued with briefly. He suggested that all the recent activity was likely part of an agenda to make sure their budget stayed afloat. But this notion didn't sit well with him as he demanded further answers from the worker. Despite numerous questions being raised by Foster, none could be answered satisfactorily, leaving him without any real closure on what he had seen or heard. Foster flashed his gun and the worker becomes intimidated, accepting that nothing was amiss with the street. When a group of kids ask him about how to work with a bazooka, Foster accidentally fired it in the sewer, which had disastrous consequences that could be felt a few blocks away. Sandra and Prendergast arrived at Foster's childhood home where Prendergast picked up several showpieces. This got Mrs. Foster's attention, so she took the cops to Foster's room. She informed them that he had been devising plans to protect them. On the other side, Foster jumps over the wall of a nearby golf club, but two men scolded him for walking through their field. One of the men shoots a ball at Foster, prompting him to grab a shotgun and start shooting indiscriminately at the golf cart. To his shock and horror, the man suffers an unexpected heart attack and requests for pills from the cart, but unfortunately it is nowhere to be seen. Prendergast then turns to Mrs. Foster to find out what was wrong with her son. She explains that he had been anxious about small matters for quite some time, including finding pictures of Foster with his ex-wife Beth. Mrs. Foster admits that she does not have any idea of where Beth could be, prompting Sandra to inform everyone that Foster had been fired a month ago. Foster gets into a big house and yells at the caretaker for having a barbed wire around the place, threatening him and his family if they don't comply with his demands. Foster questions how a plastic surgeon could afford that big house. Caretaker proposed that Foster take him instead and allow the family to go. Foster reminisced about the past and began to weep, explaining he was on his way home for his daughter's birthday. Beth tries to get the police to stay with her because of the impending threat, but they left her alone and Foster called her back. He told her all about the present he had bought for Adele. Beth abruptly hung up the phone and ran away from danger, while Foster also rushed towards the house. As he approached it, Beth and Adele escaped through a side entrance inside the house. Once inside, Foster found tapes of himself celebrating Adele's birthday. Sandra managed to find Beth's number and called her, but there was no response. Amanda then contacted Prendergast in an attempt to gain control over nature. As the guests of Prendergast prepared the retirement celebration, he taunted him with a sharp remark. In a moment of anger, he impulsively punched into the cake as they made their way out. With sorrow in his heart, Foster came to realize that he had been demanding his wife and daughter to fulfill his wishes. At that moment, Sandra and Prendergast heard the sound of a gunshot coming from inside the house. It was then that Prendergast realized he had returned his service weapon and walked in unarmed. As he rushed outside, he saw Sandra on the ground. Desperate for help, Foster runs towards Adele and Beth at the pier. Beth tearfully asked him to leave. On hearing this, Foster pulls out his gun, bellowing wordlessly with rage. Foster saw Adele, embraced her tightly and apologized for his failure to watch over her as she had grown up. Beth then interjected, reminding him of the time he had been ill, giving an addition to Foster's words. Suddenly, Beth pushed away Foster's gun and dashed off in the opposite direction, and Prendergast swiftly apprehended him and disclosed the whole truth. It was his daughter who had motivated him all along. Foster declared that he had a water gun in his pocket and viewed the situation as a showdown of sorts. However, this caused Prendergast to become even more apprehensive. In his last words, he said, "I would have got you while falling down to the ocean." In the last scene, the captain introduced Prendergast to the media, claiming credit for the event. Prendergast tells the captain to fuck off, astonishing everyone, and made conversation with Adele and Beth inside the house. Videotapes of Adele's previous birthdays were playing in the background. That is it from the movie Falling Down. Thanks so much for watching. If you've enjoyed today's video, please consider subscribing to our channel and let us know what recaps you're most interested in so we can create more content that you'll love.